What's up everybody, hello and welcome to Not Your Average Meta, an MTG Commander channel dedicated to bringing you decks and commanders you wouldn't normally find in your average meta. This week's video is brought to you by our channel sponsors International MTG on TCG Player, as well as Martin from the Hobby Horse. I'd also like to shout out Mythic Tools, the official live counter app of the channel. This is by far the best live counter app available for tracking all your commander games and stats either by yourself or with your favorite playgroup. Available on both iOS and Android. On this week's episode of Not Your Average Meta, we're bringing you another game we filmed down at the Hobby Horse. This week's matchup features a first-time appearance from Frederick playing his Lysaga Night Witch deck, Patrick playing Slinza the Spike Stampede, a commander from Jumpstart 25, Fallgirl playing his Boros Equipment deck being led by Eivor Battle Ready from Assassin's Creed, and Foil playing his Ninja Turtle from Jumpstart 25, Taeko the Patient Avalanche. Now that we have our fighters, let's step into the Thunderdome and see which deck will come out on top. Turn 1, Fog plays a mountain, Foil plays an island, and Frederick plays a Verdant Catacombs, paying the 1 life, passing his turn so he can crack it in order to go get a land from his library. Patrick plays a forest. Fog plays a plains for turn and then pays 2 for an Ancestral Blade, which has entering play attached to a 1/1 white soldier token. Foil plays another island for turn and then pays 2 to cast a Thought Vessel, before he then pays nothing to cast an Ornithopter. Frederick plays a command tower for turn and then pays 2 for a Wishclaw Talisman before passing his turn to Patrick, who then draws and discards down to hand size. Fog plays another mountain for turn before paying 3 for a White Mage's Staff, which has an entering play attached to a hero token. He then goes to combat, swinging his soldier token over Patrick for 2 damage before he then passes to Foil, who draws for turn. Foil misses his land drop but then goes to combat, swinging his Ornithopter over at Fog. But before damage, he pays 2 to Nijitsu Win, a Prosperous Thief. This then has Fog losing 3 life while he creates a treasure token and he recasts his Ornithopter, passing his turn to Frederick. Frederick plays a Swamp as his land for turn before tapping out in order to cast his commander, Lysaga. Patrick draws and then misses another land drop, forcing him to discard down to hand size once again. Fog draws and then pays 2 to cast a Hex Guild Hullbard, which comes into play attached to a 2/2 Rebel token. He then goes to combat, swinging his hero token over at Foil to deal 2 damage while he gains some life. Foil plays a Swamp as his land for turn before going to combat, swinging his Prosperous Thief over at Patrick while he swings his Ornithopter over at Frederick. But before damage, he pays in order to Nijitsu Win Nashi Moon Sage's Scion. Everybody then takes their damage, which has Foil creating 2 treasure tokens and exiling the top card of each player's library. He then chooses to pay the 1 life in order to cast Frederick's Birds of Paradise. This then also has him recasting his Ornithopter once again before passing his turn to Frederick, who plays an Inkmoth Nexus as his land for turn. He then animates the Inkmoth Nexus with its own mana before also using the Wishclaw Talisman, before sacking it to his commander, having each of his opponents lose 3 life while he gains 3 life, and draws 3 cards before tutoring a card up from his library. He then remembers to pay for his Talisman before casting a Lotus Petal, before sacking in order to cast a Utopia Sprawl and chanting his Overgrown Tomb. Frederick then pays 3 as well as 2 life in order to cast a Toxic Deluge in order to wipe the board of all creatures except his commander. Patrick draws and finally gets a second land, which he uses to help him cast a Rampant Growth, which he uses in order to go get another forest from his library to put into play. Fog draws for turn and then pays 3 for Gold Warden's Helm, which enters play attached to a 2/2 Rebel token. Foil draws and then pays to cast his commander Taeko, who comes into play tapped, before he then pays an additional 2 to suspend a Profane Tutor. Frederick draws and then pays 3 to cast Realms Uncharted, which has him going into his library to find 4 lands with different names. He then chooses Patrick to pick 2 lands to put into his hand while he puts the other 2 into his graveyard. He then plays a Mishra's Factory as his land for turn before doing the same land trick in order to have each of his opponents lose 3 life while he gains 3 life and he draws 3 cards. Patrick draws for turn and then pays 3 for Garruk's Harbinger before passing turn. Fog plays a Plains for turn before paying 2 for a Mortar Pod, which enters play attached to a Germ token. He then pays an additional 2 to cast Intangible Virtue before going to combat, swinging his Rebel over at Frederick for 3 damage. Foil untaps and then removes a counter from his Profane Tutor before he then draws for turn. He then plays a tap Path of Ancestry for turn before going to combat, swinging his commander over at Frederick for 4 commander damage. He then taps out in order to cast Cruelty of Gix, which has him reading ahead to the 2nd chapter and has him searching his library for a card while he loses 3 life. Frederick draws and then plays a Mishra's Foundry as his land for turn before he then pays 2 in order to do the same land trick. This then has each of his opponents losing 3 life while he gains 3 life and he draws 3 cards. Patrick draws for turn, and then he pays 3 and casts a Descendant's Path. Fog plays a Plains for turn before he pays 2 to cast a Sigil of Valor, and then pays an additional 3 to cast a Tavern Brawler. Foil takes the last counter off his Profane Tutor, which has been going into his library to find a card, before he then draws for turn and then uptakes his Saga to the last chapter. This then has Frederick hard selling him while trying to resurrect his Birds of Paradise from his graveyard, before he ultimately decides to bring his Prosperous Thief back from his own graveyard. He then pays to cast an Ambling Storm Shell before he goes to combat, swinging his commander over at Frederick. Frederick then responds by flashing in Orcish Bowmasters using the 1 damage to kill Fog's Germ, before he then chump blocks with his Orc token. Frederick draws for turn and then plays a Swamp before paying 4 to cast his own turtle, Blossoming Tortoise. This then has him milling 3 cards into his graveyard before he returns his Mishra's Factory back from his graveyard into play. He then uses his last floating mana to once again animate his land and sack it to his commander, which has each of his opponents losing 3 life while he gains 3 life and draws 3 cards. On his upkeep, Patrick reveals the top card of his library from his path, which happens to be a beast, so he puts it into play before he then draws for turn. Fog draws and then taps out in order to cast his commander Eivor battle ready. He then goes to combat, swinging his commander over at Frederick, which then has each of his opponents losing 6 life, while Frederick chooses not to block and loses an additional 5 from the commander damage. Foil plays an Underground Sea as his land for turn. He then goes to combat, swinging his turtle over at Frederick while he swings his commander over at Fog, paying to make him unblockable. This then has Foil drawing 3 cards and putting 3 stun counters on his turtle, while Frederick chooses to use the 3 pings in order to take out the Prosperous Thief from his Bowmaster's trigger. This then has Foil paying 2 to Ninjutsu in an Azumi Prowler, bouncing his turtle back to his hand, which has Foil forgetting to put a counter on his commander before everybody then takes their damage, and Foil pays 3 to cast a Sword of Hearth and Home. Frederick draws for turn and then pays 1 to cast a sick turn 8 Soul Ring. He then also casts a Tyvar Jubilant Brawler as well as a Mind Stone. Frederick then uses Baba Lysaga's ability in order to sack 3 different permanents, which has each of his opponents losing 3 life while he gains 3 life and draws 3 cards. He then uptakes Tyvar in order to untap his commander before he then pays 2 for a pair of Lightning Greaves. He then equips his Greaves to his commander and goes to combat, swinging his Tortoise over at Foil, which has him once again milling 3 cards into his graveyard. This then has him returning the Mishra's Factory back into play once again while he passes his turn to Patrick. Patrick then reveals another beast off the top of his library from his path trigger, which has it coming into play for free. He then draws for turn before going to combat, swinging his Axebane Feryx over at Frederick, who just takes the 4 damage. Second main, he casts a Loot Exuberant Explorer and passes his turn. On his upkeep, Fog reveals a Veil of Assimilation off his Tavern Brawler before he draws for turn. He then plays the Plains as his land for turn before paying 2 to cast the Veil of Assimilation, targeting his commander with the ETB. He then also pays to equip the Halberd to his commander to give him trample before he goes to combat, swinging his commander over at Frederick. Each of his opponents then lose another 6 life before Frederick chooses to chump block with the Bowmaster before paying to sack the Bowmaster as well as 2 other permanents to his commander. This then has each of his opponents losing an additional 3 life while he gains 3 life and draws 3 cards, and then takes the rest of the commander damage. Foil draws for turn and plays a Swamp, before he then pays to equip his commander with the Sword of Hearth and Home. He then goes to combat, swinging his commander over at Fog, who just takes the commander damage. This then has him choosing to exile his rat while he goes into his library to get an island to put into play. His rat then comes back into play, which has him remembering to put a counter on his commander before he then scribes 1 card to the bottom of his library. Finally, he pays to cast a Phantom Ninja before passing his turn to Frederick, who draws for turn. He then plays an Undergrowth Stadium as his land for turn before paying 1 for a Hopeless Nightmare, which has Patrick trying to put into play an Obstinate Baloth. In response, Frederick does the same land trick with his commander, which takes Patrick and Foil out of the game. Fog then loses his 2 life to the Hopeless Nightmare, and Frederick uses Tyvar to untap his commander. He then also tries to take Fog's commander out with a Deadly Rollick, but in response, Fog gives him protection by casting a Blacksmith skill. Frederick then goes to combat, swinging his turtle over at Fog, which has him milling 3 cards into his graveyard. Frederick then returns the Mishra's Factory back into play once again while Fog blocks the turtle. Second main, Frederick uses his commander to sack 3 permanents, which has Fog losing 3 life while he gains 3 life and draws 3 cards. before he then ultimately untaps his commander again, doing it one last time to win him the game. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe in order to see more games and decks you wouldn't normally see in your average meta.